It is Wednesday night, and it is the 7th of October, and we are 2009, by the way, and we are studying the Old Testament, and the reason we're doing it is we're studying prophecy. And people always want to know about prophecy. Well, prophecy is about Israel being scattered by the world empires, by the Babylonian Empire, by Babylon, and by Assyria. And Assyria scattered northern Israel in 722 BC. And then southern Judah was scattered by Babylon in 586 BC. And that was because all the time Israel was a nation, they went after Baal and the grove. Now, I'm going to make this part simple. We're not going to go into the 70 weeks, which is the time period God gave Israel to repent. That's all I'm going to say about it. And they were scattered for 2,600 years. 2,600 years. Northern Israel and southern Judah. And they were split into two nations because of Solomon's apostasy when he allowed all of his wives, 700 of them, 300 concubines, which were secondary wives, that he allowed them to go after their idol gods, Baal and the grove and Molech and Chemosh, etc. And the list goes on and on and on. And Israel went after other gods after God had delivered them out of about 300 to 310 years under judges, maybe 325. It depends on when you believe the judges started. If you believe Joshua was a judge, and if you believe that Samuel was a judge. Now, all that's just a matter of opinion, but I believe that Joshua was certainly the first judge of Israel, and I believe that Samuel was the last judge. So it's going to run up around 330 years. They were under judges. And Joshua, of course, was the general that led them into the promised land under his leadership, and Moses died before they left the wilderness, and they were 400 years in the wilderness, 40 years in the wilderness, and 400 years in Egypt. Now, and of course they were scattered, and brought back together at the end of time, And what we're doing is we're showing that at the end of time, they're going to come back together in one nation. We know that Israel has come back together May 14th, 1948. 1948, and the Bible says that the Jews will fall by the edge of the sword. They'll be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem will be trodden down of the Gentiles until the Gentile rule over them is finished. And when this comes about, lift up your heads and look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. When these things begin to come to pass, the end is near. Now, what we're doing is we're going back to the beginning of Genesis, and this story of Israel, all of the Bible is about one family. It's about a family, and that family is the Israelites. And Israel, we get Israel from Jacob. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and he had 12 sons, and they became the nation. That's a nation, and it's a family. And of course, the promise or the covenant was given to Abraham, and then it was given to Isaac from Abraham. Isaac was Abraham's son, and Jacob was Isaac's son, and Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And I've got all the other details on many of the other tapes, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Now, what we're doing is studying the history of Israel, but I thought last night, I've done this before, but I thought what I need to do is give you an overall review and then get back into where we were. We have studied, we started off with Genesis, the 5th chapter, and we started with Adam, and we went all the way down through the lineage of Adam from Seth all the way down to Noah. It took us through Enosh and Mahalaleel and Jared and took us through Enoch and Methuselah and Lamech, and took us to Noah. And these are all sons, and Noah's son was Shem, and we went from Shem there in the 5th chapter, and then we went over to Genesis, the 11th chapter, where we start with Arphaxad, the son of Shem, and it takes us all the way down to Abraham, and then And then you get on to Abraham, and Abraham has a son over there in the 17th chapter, and that's Isaac. And then Jacob is born to Isaac over there in the 25th chapter, 25. He's the second born of twin sons, Esau and Jacob. Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. And we went down through there, and we also went through the birth of all these 12 sons in the 29th and 30th chapters of Genesis, and had 12 sons, starting with Reuben, and then Simeon and Levi and Judah, and it goes all the way down to Joseph. These are key men in this lineage: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and then all the way down to Joseph the 11th, Benjamin the last son. And what we did is we went over and we finally ended up Joseph being sold into Egypt and ending up in Potiphar's house. And what we're trying to do is show, if God picked out a people and delivered them out of Egypt, if he put them in Egypt and brought them out of Egypt, then it appears that those people should be serving him and not some other god. Well, they went after other gods, and that same system was eventually brought into the church and renamed the Christ Mass. It was the old Feast of Saturn. The thing that's really important to understand is all of the evil of the Old Testament goes back to the tree of the garden, and all the female deities were tree deities, and they worshiped the sun, the orb of the day. They said the serpent was the enlightener of men's minds, so they worshiped the enlightenment of the day, which was the sun. And they had sun worship and tree worship and serpent worship in the ancient world, and that is the Garden of Eden worship of the tree that they had there. Now, what I'm going to do before we go further, I'm going to come back and go back into Genesis. We went through the 37th chapter where Joseph comes along, and he's 17 years old, and his brothers sell him into bondage because he has these dreams that their sheep will bow to his, and their father made Joseph, the patriarch of Israel, the leader, and they're all 38, 40, 45 years old, and Joseph is just a kid. Well, they sell him into Egypt out of anger, and then we went into the 38th chapter. That's the chapter of Judah and Tamar, and I'm not even going to talk about that. We got an entire message on that, very interesting. And then the 39th chapter is where we'll come back to. I'll have to come back to the 39th chapter. That is where Joseph ends up in the house of Potiphar, the captain of the host of Pharaoh in Egypt. And the story of Joseph starts in the 37th chapter and goes through the 50th chapter of Genesis. Now, this is a family and a people. I'm going to keep reminding you of this. Now, Genesis, the book of Genesis starts, of course, I went recently through the first chapter of Genesis, not all of it, but the first chapter of Genesis, Genesis 1, is about the creation, and then the earth becoming without form and void, without form, and then after becoming without form, then you got 6 days of making and forming. And on the 6th day, there's not 6 days of creation, there's 6 days of the work of a potter. The creation is in the first verse. I'm not going to go through that right now. I went through an entire message on that. And the 6th day, God creates man, and it was the custom of the Jews to say they did something, then turn around and tell you how they did it and explain it. Well, in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, that is the 6th day. This is the 6th day where God speaks in the 26th verse of the first chapter, 26th verse of the first chapter. He says, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, male and female created he them. Well, the 6th day is that 2nd chapter. God forms Adam out of the dust of the ground, of corrupt dust, and he breathes into his nostrils the breath of life, and that's how he creates him. And then then he sets up a tree in the garden. He says, don't go near the tree. I mean, you know, if God hadn't put the tree there, it wouldn't have been sin. So I guess God created sin, didn't he? Well, yes, he did. He put man in a body that couldn't keep from sinning, and he puts a tree there and says, don't eat, and you can't keep from it. It's what he does to us. He gives us a book, says don't eat, and we can't keep from it. Isn't that right? Does the same thing to us. Now, then you get into the 3rd chapter, Genesis, the 3rd chapter, and this is where Eve is seduced. Not physically seduced, she's seduced mentally. Eve did not have a sexual affair with Satan. The way a man is a child of the devil, Jesus called the Pharisees in the 8th chapter of John children of the devil. He said, your father's the devil. It doesn't mean that their literal fathers had a sexual episode with the devil. That's going to kind of cut short that belief that there's that Satan had an affair with Eve. Now Eve became the mother of all living, and that's in the 3rd chapter. God drives Adam and Eve out of the garden. And then Genesis, the 4th chapter, that's where Cain kills Abel, and you see the lineage of Cain. And in the 5th chapter, that's an evil lineage. These are idol worshippers. These are sons of men. And in the 5th chapter, that's the righteous lineage of God. These are sons of God. When in the 6th chapter, the sons of God look at the daughters of men, that means the idol worshippers, descendants of Cain, look upon the descendants of, or the sons of God look upon the descendants of Cain. They're good-looking women, and they intermarry truth to a lie. That's what the 6th chapter is about. It's not about angels coming down from heaven and intermarrying with women. I've done entire messages on that. Now, in the book of Genesis, whenever you date Genesis, you have to date Genesis from Exodus, the 2nd chapter. Exodus, the 2nd chapter, was approximately 1571 BC. In fact, if you've got a Thompson chain, you go to Exodus, the 1st chapter. 2nd chapter, excuse me. And it'll give you right out. Let me show you how you date Genesis. The dates in Genesis are completely dependent on Exodus. You can start in Exodus and date the events of Old Testament, of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, all the way through the Old Testament. You can date the Old Testament starting with the dates of Exodus. But you cannot date Genesis, and the only way you can date Genesis is using the dates on Exodus. Now, some people differ a little bit on Exodus, but it is going to be around 1571. Now, the way you date Genesis, I might go ahead and show you this. The way you date Genesis is you have to back up from 1571. You have to back up to 400 years. And why 400 years? They were in bondage 400 years. You got 2 sets of 400 years in the Bible. You got one here, and where's the other one? In between the Testaments. At the end of Malachi, beginning of Matthew, you got 400 silent years. Now, you do have some of the events that happened there under the Maccabees. And the Maccabees was the story of the Hasmonean dynasty, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers.